If you're an author or plan to be one, get excited because this podcast is for you. Book Marketing Mentors is the only podcast dedicated to helping you successfully market and sell your book. If you're ready for empowering conversations with successful marketing mavens, then grab a coffee or tea and listen in to your host, international best-selling author Susan Friedman.
Welcome to Book Marketing Mentors, the weekly podcast where you learn proven strategies, tools, ideas, and tips from the masters. Every week, I introduce you to a marketing master who will share their expertise to help you market and sell more books. Today, my special guest is Michael Katz. Michael specializes in helping professional service firms and solopreneurs develop effective email newsletters. Since launching Blue Penguin in 2000, Michael has been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Business Week Online, Forbes.com, and other national media. He's the author of 4 books and has published more than 500 issues of the Likeable Expert Gazette, a twice-monthly email newsletter and podcast. Michael, what an absolute pleasure it is to welcome you to the show, and thank you for being this week's guest expert and mentor.
Thanks for the invitation.
Michael, you and I were talking before, and I said I didn't know that newsletters were still alive and well. And obviously, based on the business that you're doing, they certainly are. Talk to us about it, because I remember when I first started my business some, 30 years ago, newsletters were the hot thing. And then they seemed, in my opinion, to have died. But obviously, I was wrong. So talk to us about newsletters.
Rumors of our death have been exaggerated. It's interesting. They have waxed and waned over the years. When I talk about newsletters, I'm strictly involved in electronics. So I think around the late 90s, when the internet was coming on, most newsletters were still paper. What's interesting to me is when I first started in 2002, maybe, I started doing newsletters. The biggest objection I would hear from potential clients was that not enough of their customers had email. And then over the next 20 years, in the mid 2000s, like 2005, 6, I couldn't pick up the phone fast enough. Then blogs were going to kill email, and then social media was going to kill email. It certainly varied. I've been waiting for something to replace email. Newsletters are really just a glorified email, but nothing has come along. I've waited with some concern that, will I lose my business? But even pre-COVID, for the last 4 or 5 years, emails had this resurgence. I think partly because people are questioning the value of social as a business tool. It's also social, which is, again, the alternative generally, has all kinds of privacy issues that, we've seen. And then the other one people don't seem to think about is that there's all kinds of rules on social. LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, we've seen they can throw you off. They can change what they're going to do. And if you decide to leave, so you may have a big following on Facebook or LinkedIn, you can leave, but you can't take your list with you. Whereas email, what I've always liked is it's a completely distributed system. Nobody owns email. And so it's a really direct connection between you and whoever wants to hear from you, which I like, and a bunch of other things. So no, it's chugging along, and it's definitely picked up again in recent years.
And I really like that, because I know that email is where you need to go and get your people on your list, rather than, as you said, on social. Building a house on rented land isn't, as they're talking about it with any of the platforms, the social media platforms. And as you rightly say, you can't take the list with you. If they go down, like, as we know, Facebook went down several months ago, maybe it was a year or so ago, but they went down and people panicked. They were down for like 6 to 8 hours. And some people were really, really like, what am I going to do? This is my whole life is on there.
I think also what's interesting is email is somehow more personal and even intimate. I don't know anyone who doesn't check email every single day. I saw a statistic, which I actually have trouble believing, but it said that 99% of people with an email account check at least once a day. When you can sign up for a social media account without an email account, then I'll believe email's dead. But it's still this sort of, it's like the thing of record. Like, you got to have an email address to participate in electronic society today. So anyway, it's still going along. And newsletters, I'm sure we'll talk about, but have a lot of advantages to them especially for business people.
That's a great segue, Michael, in talking about what are the benefits? Why should we be doing that versus, let's say, an article? I mean,
Yeah.
what's in terms of the messaging and then the acceptability of a newsletter?
So a few things. And this is from the perspective of marketing yourself and your business. And I specialize in working with professional service firms, financial planners, consultants, writers, so people who work for themselves more or less, or, small firms. One of the biggest problems we have is visibility. And so even if you were lucky enough to get 30 seconds on the Super Bowl with an ad for free, the problem is a week later, everybody's forgotten it. So there's this issue of ongoing visibility, which a newsletter provides, because it's really kind of like exercise. It's not a big bang event. It's you publish over and over again. And over time, people who like you and like what you have to say will get to remember you and get a sense of who you are. That's really powerful. It's sort of like everyone on this call is going to buy a refrigerator in the next 15 years, but probably nobody's going to buy one in the next 15 minutes. And so if you sell refrigerators, your problem is you have to advertise all the time. You got to be in front of people when they're ready. So this sort of solves that. You're always top of mind. It's a true story. I got a call last week from a woman who I vaguely could remember who she was. She has an unusual name. So I was like, kind of familiar. She left me a message. It turned out she had signed up for my newsletter 5 years ago, and we had coffee once about 4 years ago, and was calling to say she was interested in moving ahead with a newsletter. And she specifically said it was only because I've been publishing all this time that I stayed in her brain, even though I couldn't remember even who she was. So very powerful, this sort of repeat thing that people like us don't have, the money to advertise. So that's one. Another is it's a long format thing. The average newsletter I get involved in is 600 to 800 words, long enough that you can share some information that the person on the receiving end will find useful or entertaining or whatever. So it gives people a sense of how you think, who you are, what you do, that you really don't get in social, which is short format, or even in like a networking meeting where you may know what the other person does, but you don't have a real insight into how they think and all that. So the long format gives people a sense of you. And again, when you combine that with the repeating, it's just a really good marketing tool.
You talk about the format, 600 to 800 words. How's that divided up? Are there separate columns? Is there, just one article? What do you do?
I think there's a lot of potential for variation. And so I don't think you have to follow a total recipe. My approach is one introductory note that goes, "Hi, how you doing? Today we're going to talk about blah, blah, blah." It's almost like a sticky note that you used to put on an article in the old days before you put it in the mail. It's a way to make this personal connection. So that's something that you don't get with an article you read in a publication. I'm always working on the relationship side of things. So that's an opportunity. Then there'll be an article. I always say it needs to be long enough that the person reading it will learn something and kind of go, "Oh, okay, I just got a little insight." And I think have enough running room that you can share some information, personal stuff like where you live, or I went on vacation, or my dog does this weird thing. It sounds so non-professional, unbusinessy, but what I've found, particularly if you sell a professional service where what you do is very similar, or at least it appears very similar to the competition, who you are is the real differentiator, not your expertise. Because, I can't tell. Like, you don't know how medically capable your own doctor is. And frankly, it doesn't really matter. If you like your doctor, it's because she listens to you, or, you like how she talks to you, or that kind of thing. So I try to incorporate that. And then there's, again, the kind I use, there's usually another small section or two with a little tidbit. But the key is valuable plus personal information. I would say, though, you can't have columns anymore because it has to work really well on a phone. Half the emails are opened on a phone today. And so columns don't work anymore. It's got to be like one long thing. But otherwise, there's a fair amount of room for doing it however you like.
And what about graphics? Do you add graphics to that to make it more interesting?
It's so funny. This question, if you go back into email newsletter history, has bounced back and forth literally for 20 years. So initially, emails, there was no graphics because in 2001, you couldn't do graphics. So it was just an email. It was just words. Then people like Constant Contact were born, and they're like, look, you can do graphics. And so it became insane with graphics, like too many. Everybody was doing it. And then it sort of got back and forth. Some people think that if it's just text, it feels more personal. So they prefer that. Plus, it is easier to produce. Other people, and I fall into this camp, feel like, well, it's sort of like any other marketing thing you might do. You have colors and a logo, and I think it's more eye-catching to have some imagery. So you don't want to go crazy, but I think it's helpful to have it feel like, something deliberately done, that you didn't just wake up this morning and do it. I think of an email newsletter like a magazine. Time magazine, I could show you Cosmopolitan in Ukrainian, and you'd have no idea what the words were, but you'd recognize it as what it is because it has a look. So I think you want to kind of have that. But again, I'd say if that's what's keeping you from getting going, just do text. You can always go back the other way later on.
In one of your email newsletters, in fact, I think it was the most recent one, you give a personal story and then you connect that story to some piece of learning or something that relates more to the business side of things. That connection part for me personally is one of the most challenging things. I could tell the story, or I could talk about tips or this technique or this strategy, but bringing the two together, are there some tricks to that?
Well, it's definitely kind of a learned skill. And I don't know how I adopted this approach, but I found it to be like tremendously effective. So my basic formula for a newsletter for myself and my clients is there's some totally out of the blue opening story. The reason for that is humans are hardwired to listen to stories. Anytime I speak in public to a group, as soon as I'm introduced, I walk out there and the first thing I say is, let me tell you a quick story. And everybody just sort of perks up because, again, it's interesting to us. And then it has to connect, I'll talk about in a second, to some useful thing. Because, again, nobody's signed on to your newsletter to hear a story about your dog. However, when you connect the two, it's very memorable, interesting, and all that. The learned part is, how do you make that connection? So it doesn't have to be a great connection, but I'll give you just a made-up example. I once wrote a newsletter about the fact that my then, I think, 6-year-old son found a snake outside, and he brought it into the house and said, look. So again, who cares? Nothing to do with anything, but it's the kind of thing you might tell a friend over lunch. And then from there, I could go a couple of ways. I could make a connection, and I literally sit down and do this. Well, what's interesting about snakes? Well, they eat like once a month. I could connect that to the fact that you also need to be known for something in particular in your business. Or I could talk about snakes shed their skin. And so it's important occasionally to, change your branding. I don't know, just making it up. But the idea is that you just need some connection. I think of it like a little bridge where you take a step from one to the other. Nobody ever comes back and says, wait a second, that's not a great metaphor. But again, it's very compelling. And I have to say, this share personal information thing to varying degrees is a big part of the discussion I have with clients early on. Because, my clients, like your listeners, they're like serious business people. And they're like, well, who cares about my kid's snake? But this differentiator is valuable because, again, the truth is what you sell and how you do it and your expertise, everyone you compete with has that. They don't have a story about the kid with the snake. So it's a good way to get people's attention and to get them to remember you, like you, all that kind of stuff.
The number of, let's say, words that you would use for a story versus the actual learning part of it. Is there a 50-50? Is it a 40-60? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm just, as you're asking, I'm thinking. I would say for most of my clients, it's probably 25% story, 75% information. And I do a storytelling course on this where you have to give me enough information when you tell a story that I can kind of place myself there. I can picture what you're talking about. So again, I wouldn't just say my son walked in the kitchen with a snake and then go right to the whole thing. I have to tell you my son's name and what it was, what the snake looked like, and why I was, scared that he had a snake. It's the same amount of information you would give if, again, you and I were having lunch. And I said, you wouldn't believe what happened yesterday. My son came in the house with a snake. I wouldn't just leave it there. I'd kind of give you a little more. So it's that much. But people don't really care about that. It's just enough to capture their attention. I would say I almost never have to talk people back from too much story. Even if people buy the idea of story is valuable, at least in the beginning, there's still this reluctance to, quote, waste people's time. And so I end up saying, well, I need a little more here. But I'd say 75% is probably a good rule of thumb.
Yes, because my thought is, well, will somebody continue reading that to get to the main piece? Sometimes, and that's me again, I always wanted, well, tell me what you're going to tell me.
It's a funny thing. I mean, I often hear, well, people don't have time. You got to get right to it. I heard somebody say, today, everybody's either got 3 minutes or 2 hours. Podcasts are so long, but otherwise nobody has any time. I don't quite buy that argument. I always feel like, look, there's the same amount of time today in a day as there was 100 years ago. People are more discerning, but somebody's reading Harry Potter and watching 8 seasons of The Sopranos. So people have enough time if they're interested. The thing about a story is a story grabs you right from the beginning. We don't have time here, but when I do my storytelling class, I open with this story about how I was held up at gunpoint. And it only takes me about 3 minutes. I get right into the middle of it and I just say, like, imagine if I stopped right now and didn't tell you what happened. Like, you'd find it annoying. So again, there's something about the way people think that they want to know what happened. So I think the story, again, there's varying degrees of how well people can tell a story, is a great way to start. And I do think you get people moving into the next main business part from there.
With story, Michael, yes, there's that open loop. You're opening the loop with that story, and people want you to close that loop.
That's a good description of it. I'm going to have to remember that. Yes.
It's not mine, but have you ever opened the loop at the beginning and then left people hanging, talk about the information, and then close the loop at the end?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a sort of standard writer's technique, which may not be quite what you're describing, but the idea that at the very end, if you can have your last sentence, bring it back to the snake. People sort of find that satisfying. In fact, I just did that with a client this morning whose newsletter had to do with her having this sort of concern when she would sit down to write a proposal, something she would refer to as her gremlin. And that was her opening story about having to write a proposal. And then she just went into this idea of gremlins and how they play with your mind. And the last line of it was something like, I got to run, I got a proposal to write, and I need to talk to my gremlin. So she was bringing it all the way back. I think also that same closing the loop idea is very effective.
Finding a topic, people never know exactly what to say. How do you find a topic?
I think the magazine analogy works really well. For one thing, it points you towards an audience as opposed to this is about me. Of course, you're doing it because you're trying to promote your business. Most of us are not writing newsletters for the sake of writing. And so you have to do some work around what do you know? What's your body of knowledge? And who's your audience? The good news is the people you're generally writing to are the people who would hire you. So if you take the example of I have a client who's a small business attorney. So her potential clients are people like me, small business owners. Then we just make a list of, hey, what are the questions you hear from people like me? What's a non-disclosure agreement? What should you never do when signing a contract? How do you get out of a bad agreement? I mean, it's all the kind of basic FAQs that we all hear in our world every day. If you satisfy that, you're sort of satisfying the idea that I'm here because I want something that will help me live my life or do my job better. So it's not complicated. In the example of my client, the attorney, it's very simple legal stuff. It's the kind of stuff that another attorney would say, well, no kidding. But for almost all of us, our potential audience of clients don't know anything about what we do. So it's really like legal stuff 101 or, how to write 101 or whatever you do. And so I find, again, with a little bit of work, people can just come up with a list of questions that they then answer. You have to start paying attention to what are the things you're explaining to clients sort of over and over again. Those are really good subjects.
What about posting these newsletters on social media? Do you do that at all, or is it strictly that these go out to an email list?
My philosophy is write once, distribute often. So 20 years ago, when you published a newsletter, it just went as an email, and that was it. there was no such thing as social or even blogs. And so if somebody signed up for your newsletter 30 seconds after you published, not only did they not get that one, they didn't get any of the ones you sent before. Then again, the late 2000s or so, somebody invented the blog, and now it was easy to post content. And so when we post a newsletter and send it as an email, we'll take generally just the main article, that's 600 to 800 words, post that on the person's website. Now it's a blog. The only difference is one's an email and one's a website page. And now we'll take pieces of that and run it through their social media, almost always LinkedIn, sometimes Twitter, sometimes Facebook, depends on the client and their audience. And then in my case, as you and I chatted earlier, I record my newsletter. Now it's a podcast. So the idea is heavy lifting is writing that article. Now, how many ways can you use it? The last 2 books I published were just reconfigured old newsletters. So now it's a book. It's interesting how there's all these new ways to use that same content that you didn't have in recent years. So it's really more bang for your buck than before.
That's exactly how Seth Godin did it with his book. He took his blog posts and he compiled them all into one of his books, and it was brilliant. It gave people
so
ideas.
Funny?
Yeah.
It's so funny, Susan, that you mentioned that. Is I published a book, I don't know, like 10 years ago, the first time I used old newsletters. And I was thinking, well, I can't really, that's sort of cheating. And I tried for months to write a book on the topic, which had to do with working for yourself. And it just never felt anywhere near as good as my newsletters. And then I see Seth Godin's book. It's like 2 inches thick of 10 years of blog posts. All he did is he alphabetized them by the title. And I thought, okay, if he can do that, then I can do that with my newsletters. And so I was very happy to be able to just, take the sort of best of and turn them into a book.
Michael, tell our listeners how they can find out more about you, what you do, and maybe even about your books, where they could find your books.
Yeah. Books are all on Amazon. And not surprisingly, I have a newsletter. It comes out every 2 weeks. It's on marketing for small business firms. And you can find all of that and subscribe at my website, which is just michaelkatz.com.
Do you charge for your newsletter, or is that a freebie?
It's absolutely free for the rest of your life, or mine, whichever comes first.
I love that. I'm going to sign up because it sounds fascinating. You've got some great information. Michael, if you were to leave our listeners with a golden nugget, what would that be?
I think it's really important to make your newsletter feel like it's an authentic representation of you as possible. People tend to fall into either it's all business because, it's a business newsletter, no, all serious, or they take on this weird over-the-top marketing persona because, that's what you're supposed to do. To me, a newsletter should feel like I just had a cup of coffee with you. So as much as possible, try and capture your voice. And I find a great way to do that is read it out loud after you've written it. And if it sounds normal to you, whatever normal is, then you're on the right track.
I've heard that before. You read it out loud, even just for seeing that all the words are there, because I have a tendency to think faster than I can write. And so I'm missing a few words sometimes. So reading it out loud is a good test.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great proofreading thing.
It's a great proofreading tip. Michael, I love all the great information that you've shared with us. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for taking time out of your precious day to listen to this interview. And I sincerely hope that it sparks some ideas you can use to sell more books. Here's wishing you much book and author marketing success.
The time is now to take action and finally build your book-selling empire. And the great news is that Susan is here to help you. Visit bookmarketingmentors.com and sign up for a free 15-minute book marketing strategy session with Susan. She'll help you discover your first steps to marketing and selling your book. Only those who take action are rewarded, so visit bookmarketingmentors.com, and we'll see you again next week.